In 2026, something happened in the world of technology that many people once believed was impossible. For decades, Linux was the underdog, the quiet powerhouse running servers, supercomputers, and Android phones, while Windows dominated the desktop. It was the system most people grew up with, the default choice for gaming, office work, and everyday computing. Linux was admired, respected, even loved by its community, but rarely considered a true threat to Microsoft's desktop empire. And yet, here we are in 2026, watching a shift that feels less like an incremental update and more like a tectonic movement beneath the entire computing industry. Linux didn't just improve, it crossed a line. It solved problems that critics used to hold over its head. It unified experiences that were once fragmented. It delivered performance, polish, and practicality at a level that forced even lifelong Windows users to take a second look. The question now isn't whether Linux is viable. The question is whether Windows can survive this shift. For years, the biggest criticism of Linux on the desktop was fragmentation. Too many distributions, too many package formats, too many desktop environments, too many ways to do the same thing. Beginners felt overwhelmed. Developers struggled with compatibility. Hardware vendors hesitated to commit fully. Meanwhile, Windows offered a single unified target. Love it or hate it, you knew what you were getting. In 2026, that narrative has changed dramatically. The Linux ecosystem didn't eliminate diversity, but it found a way to harmonize it. Universal packaging systems matured to the point where installing software became as simple and predictable as it is on any mainstream platform. Developers could target a stable base without worrying about breaking on dozens of variations. Users could switch distributions without relearning everything from scratch. What once looked like chaos began to look like freedom with structure. Performance has always been one of Linux's quiet strengths, but in 2026 it became impossible to ignore. With refinements in the kernel, smarter scheduling for modern hybrid CPUs, and dramatically improved graphics stacks, Linux started outperforming Windows in real-world desktop benchmarks, not just synthetic tests. Applications launched faster. Memory usage stayed lean. Background processes didn't quietly eat up system resources. On the same hardware, users began noticing that their machines simply felt more responsive under Linux. Older laptops gained new life. Budget PCs stopped feeling like compromises. The narrative that you needed the latest hardware to enjoy a smooth computing experience started to crumble. Suddenly, Linux wasn't just an alternative. It was the smarter choice for performance-conscious users. Gaming, long considered Windows' untouchable stronghold, experienced a revolution. Over the past few years leading up to 2026, compatibility layers and translation technologies improved at a staggering pace. Game launchers that once ignored Linux began offering native support. Anti-cheat systems, which used to block Linux users entirely, adapted to new standards. By 2026, the majority of top-tier games either ran natively on Linux or performed so well through compatibility tools that the difference was negligible. Gamers discovered something surprising. Not only could they play their favorite titles, but in many cases they experienced more stable frame rates and fewer intrusive background updates. The myth that Linux was only for programmers and hobbyists finally shattered in the gaming community. When streamers began showcasing Linux desktops without apology, the psychological barrier broke. If gaming works, everything else probably does too. Enterprise adoption also reached a new phase. Companies had already trusted Linux in their data centers for decades, but 2026 marked a noticeable expansion onto employee desktops and laptops. The reasons were practical. Licensing costs continued to rise in the proprietary software world. Subscription fatigue became real. Businesses started asking why they were paying recurring fees for operating systems that increasingly pushed cloud integration, ads, and telemetry. Linux offered a different proposition: control. Organizations could customize, audit, and deploy systems without being locked into a single vendor's roadmap. Security audits became easier with open codebases. Updates could be tested and rolled out on internal schedules. For industries where compliance and transparency mattered, this was more than a convenience. It was a strategic advantage. Security has always been part of Linux's identity, but in 2026 it evolved beyond just technical resilience. The public conversation around privacy intensified over the past decade. Users became more aware of how much data their systems collected. They noticed advertisements appearing inside core operating system components. They questioned why default settings often favored telemetry over transparency. Linux distributions leaned into this awareness. Clear privacy policies, minimal data collection, and user-first design choices resonated strongly with a generation that grew up skeptical of big tech. When people realized they could have a modern, beautiful, high-performance system without feeling surveilled, the appeal became emotional as well as technical. Another factor in this shift was hardware support. Historically, one of Linux's weak points on the desktop was inconsistent driver availability, especially for cutting-edge components. In 2026, that gap narrowed significantly. Hardware manufacturers, seeing the steady growth of Linux desktop users and the overwhelming dominance of Linux in servers and cloud infrastructure, began treating Linux support as a first-class priority rather than an afterthought. Graphics drivers matured. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chipsets worked out of the box. Firmware updates integrated seamlessly. The out-of-the-box experience improved so much that first-time installers were often surprised by how little tweaking was required. The old stereotype of spending hours in a terminal just to get basic hardware working faded into history. Meanwhile, Windows found itself in a complicated position. Microsoft had spent years pushing toward a services-driven ecosystem, integrating cloud features deeply into the operating system. For some users, this was convenient. For others, it felt invasive. System requirements crept upward. Older hardware was left behind. Mandatory online accounts became more common. Updates sometimes arrived at inconvenient times, occasionally disrupting workflows. None of these issues alone would have triggered a mass shift, but together they created friction. And in a competitive landscape, friction is opportunity. Linux distributions capitalized on that opportunity by focusing on user experience. Desktop environments became more cohesive and visually refined. Animations felt smooth and intentional. Settings panels were logically organized. Accessibility features improved. Developers paid attention to small details that once separated Linux from commercial operating systems. The result was a platform that felt not just functional, but premium. Users who installed Linux in 2026 no longer felt like they were stepping into a compromise. They felt like they were stepping into a deliberate choice. Education played a surprising role in accelerating this shift. Schools and universities increasingly adopted Linux-based systems for labs and remote learning environments. Students grew comfortable with open-source tools from an early age. When they entered the workforce, they brought those preferences with them. Employers discovered that new hires didn't see Linux as intimidating, they saw it as normal. This generational familiarity reduced resistance inside organizations considering migration. The developer community also contributed massively to Linux's momentum. Modern development workflows often revolve around containers, virtual machines, and cloud-native tools that align naturally with Linux environments. While Windows introduced compatibility layers and subsystems to bridge gaps, many developers preferred running tools directly on Linux without abstraction. In 2026, as AI development, data science, and distributed systems continued to grow, Linux's dominance in these fields reinforced its relevance on personal machines. If your production servers run Linux and your development environment runs Linux, why not your daily desktop as well? One of the most remarkable aspects of the shift is how it happened gradually and then suddenly. For years, Linux desktop market share ticked upward slowly, almost imperceptibly. Then certain milestones were reached. Major OEMs began shipping laptops with Linux pre-installed, not just as niche offerings but as mainstream options. Retailers started showcasing Linux devices prominently. Reviewers treated Linux models as equal competitors rather than curiosities. When consumers could walk into a store and buy a sleek, powerful laptop running Linux out of the box, the barrier to entry collapsed further. There's also a philosophical dimension to what happened in 2026. Open source software represents a different power structure. Instead of a single corporation dictating direction, development happens collaboratively across communities and companies. This can be messy, but it also means resilience. When one contributor steps back, others step forward. When users demand features, they can sometimes build them or sponsor their development directly. In an era where trust in large corporations fluctuates, this distributed model gained symbolic strength. Choosing Linux became, for some, a statement about digital autonomy. Of course, Windows is far from irrelevant. It remains deeply entrenched in corporate environments, specialized software ecosystems, and certain professional workflows. Many creative tools, enterprise management systems, and legacy applications still rely heavily on Windows. Microsoft continues to innovate, integrating AI assistants deeply into its platform and leveraging its massive cloud infrastructure. The company is not standing still, but the dynamic has changed. Instead of Linux playing defense, explaining why it's good enough, Windows increasingly finds itself explaining why it's worth the trade-offs. The psychological shift might be the most significant development of all. For decades, recommending Linux to a typical user required caveats. You had to ask what software they needed, whether they were comfortable troubleshooting, whether they were willing to adapt. In 2026, those caveats shrank. For a large percentage of users whose computing revolves around browsers, office suites, media consumption, communication apps, and gaming, Linux covers everything without drama. The conversation flipped from "why would you use Linux?" to "why aren't you at least trying it?" Content creators and influencers amplified this narrative. YouTube channels, tech bloggers, and social media personalities documented their transitions. They shared installation guides, customization tips, performance comparisons. Millions watched as familiar faces replaced their Windows setups with Linux desktops and reported positive experiences. Visibility matters. When people see others succeeding with a platform, their hesitation decreases. Another catalyst was sustainability. Extending the lifespan of hardware became both an economic and environmental priority. Linux's efficiency made it ideal for reviving older machines. Communities organized donation programs where refurbished laptops running Linux were distributed to students and underserved populations. Governments noticed. Public sector institutions, under pressure to reduce costs and electronic waste, began evaluating Linux-based solutions more seriously. In some regions, pilot programs expanded into full deployments. In 2026, artificial intelligence integration also influenced the operating system landscape. While proprietary systems embedded AI deeply, often tied to cloud services, Linux communities experimented with local-first AI models. Users could run powerful assistants offline, maintaining control over their data. This resonated strongly with privacy-conscious individuals and organizations handling sensitive information. The idea that you could harness advanced AI without surrendering data to remote servers felt empowering. So can Windows survive this shift? Survival might not even be the right word. Windows is too established, too integrated into global infrastructure to vanish overnight. But dominance is different from survival. The era of unquestioned supremacy appears to be ending. Competition forces evolution. If Linux's rise pressures Microsoft to prioritize user trust, efficiency, and transparency, consumers ultimately benefit. The story of 2026 isn't about one operating system destroying another, it's about balance being restored. For the first time in mainstream desktop history, users have a genuine choice without compromise. Linux achieved what once seemed impossible. It matched and in many areas surpassed Windows in usability, compatibility, performance, and polish, all while retaining its open ethos. That accomplishment reshaped expectations. Looking forward, the trajectory suggests continued diversification. Some users will remain loyal to Windows for specific needs. Others will embrace Linux fully. Many will navigate between ecosystems fluidly. The key difference compared to a decade ago is that Linux is no longer the experimental side project on a spare partition. It's a primary system powering daily work, play, and creativity for millions more people. The impossible wasn't that Linux improved. It was that it unified its strengths, overcame its historical weaknesses, and presented itself confidently to the world at exactly the moment when users were ready for an alternative. Timing, community persistence, technological maturity, and cultural shifts converged. Windows can survive, but it can no longer ignore the reality that the ground beneath it has moved. In 2026, Linux didn't just gain market share. It gained legitimacy in the eyes of mainstream users. It transformed from an enthusiast's recommendation into a credible default. And once a default changes in people's minds, the industry follows. The next few years will determine how both ecosystems adapt, but one thing is certain: the era where Linux was considered impossible on the desktop is over. The shift has happened. The only question left is how far it will go.